Thank you, everybody, for making the time to be here tonight and to spend some time with the saints here at Manslick Road and from really kind of all over the Kentuckiana area. That's been the case every night when I look out. I recognize people that I know live all over both sides of the river here in this area, so I'm just appreciate that you are willing to come over and spend an hour in this way. It's just it's a blessing for me to continue to get opportunities to come back into this city and to renew relationships with so many of you. I just want to tell you that so that I can say thank you for your time with me here and for your hospitality in so many different ways. And then also just to say it is genuinely my prayer still in any time that I am able to stand up in front of God's people that we're not taking this opportunity for granted because of our relationship with each other. We're being reminded of the truth that God has spoken and how it really impacts and changes our lives. And so I hope sincerely that that's what happens tonight. Let me begin with these words that you know well. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. This is obviously the first main point of Jesus' masterpiece Sermon on the Mount. The explanation that is the crux of all of his teachings. The explanation of not only how his people behave, but how we think of ourselves, how we understand our very identity, that we are his people. And therefore, those two ideas that you heard right there, we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. I think it's really important that God's people hear that as a statement of what is. And tonight that's my goal, is to help us to hear that as a statement of what is. Not just what should be, right? Jesus doesn't say you should be the light of the world. He says you are the light of the world, the salt of the earth. And what that compels us to do is not only figure out some techniques to act out the salt of the earth and the light of the world. It helps us to embrace that as a very identity, that it defines how we think of ourselves. And so tonight, what I hope to do is to show us that these simple teachings are still as deeply impactful as they were when the Lord himself first spoke them. When we think about who Christians are, and particularly who Christians are in this world, I imagine that for a lot of us, we think we might look a lot like our neighbors. You know, we live in the same kind of houses that they do, by and large. We have jobs that are very much like theirs. Our kids are in schools that are very much like their kids are in. The unbelieving world and us, we spend a lot of our time doing many of the same things. Now, there's obviously some variation, and just you being here tonight is evidence of that. There are some things that are different, but there are a lot of things that are broadly the same. And so we think, perhaps, well, we're a whole lot like them. But the reality is, and you know this, that Jesus is telling us not to think of ourselves as being close to the world. Yes, close in proximity, but not close at all in substance. We are called to be a very different kind of people with a very different mindset and worldview and set of words and actions from the unbelieving people around us. And I think the best place to see that first is right there in the Beatitudes. The opening of the Sermon on the Mount, he describes what the blessed life is, the good life. And what is the good life like? It's unlike anybody else expects a good life will be. It's not at all what people around us will say leads to a good life. Because the people who live the good life are those who are poor in spirit. They're the people who mourn for the disaster that they see around them in the lives of others. They're people who are meek and quiet and humble, who are okay with being thought of as unimportant. The people who live the good life are the ones who get out of the way of other people. But more than that, the people who live the good life are those who see far beyond what normal human wisdom tells us is the good life. That's who Jesus' disciples are supposed to be. People who willingly face suffering, who willingly face ostracization, people who are lowly and willing to serve others. Because we're not out to just fulfill our desires. We're out to show mercy to others, to keep our hearts pure, and to actively create peace in the world. Now, Jesus is going to tell us right there, and it's very obvious, there's so many blessings that come from that. That's the whole point. Blessed are those who do these things. But let me just ask you this question. Is living the good life going to make everybody around you happy? Is living the good life going to help to build all the great relationships and great reputation that the world would tell you should make your life good? I found it really interesting, and the more I ponder this, it's so simple, but the more it just confuses me, that the people who are persecuted and have evil things said about them, it's because they follow somebody whose message is one of love and peace and good works. And the people who get reviled and have all sorts of slanderous things said about them are actually described here as peacemakers. The irony in that, it begs belief, you know. It's difficult to wrap our minds around. Because his followers get persecuted all the time for the same thing that he got persecuted for going about doing good. And we suffer for it again and again and again. But this is what he says is the good life. These are the characteristics of disciples. It's not just a name that we claim to wear in life. It's not just a set of religious practices. It's not just an amount of money donated to a certain type of cause or a candidate or a party that we vote for. It's not any sort of legacy of writing or teaching or gaining some sort of big following. It's not any of that. The things that he says hallmark someone as great are a poor spirit, a willingness to mourn the damage that sin does, the humility before God to hunger and thirst for what he wants, not what I want. That's the good life. And it's upside down from every other society's expectations. Those are the characteristics then of following Jesus. And that's what's going to change us. It's going to be that our desires themselves have been completely redirected Not just that we want the same stuff we wanted before, but we decide, to do it God's way. But that everything about what we actually want starts to change too. And when we learn to want God, and we learn to be poor in spirit, if not to be made rich by Him, then our lives can become fulfilled and happy and complete. And it's knowing that leads me to the question about who we are. How do you think that people who live their lives that way are going to fare in the world? How do we think, how do we expect, how would we hope that people who live their lives like that are going to fare in the world around us? Now let me put that in specific terms and just see if it changes the impact of the question. When you live your life in the ways that Jesus describes in the Beatitudes, how are you going to fare in the suburbs? In the typical rhythms of life that go with suburban living, how is this going to play out for you? Is it going to go well? And in some ways you might say, yeah, I think it will. And in other ways you go, I can see how it's going to cause problems. Well, what about if you live in a small town? How is living the poor in spirit, hungered and thirsting for righteousness kind of life going to go, living in a small town? What about if you live in a bad neighborhood of a major urban center? One of those places that people talk about where they say, this is the last street you should cross, right? What about on the other side of that street? How's it going to go living Jesus' kind of life in that neighborhood? Now add to that these other dimensions. How would you fare living Jesus' style of life in an Islamic-ruled country? How's that going to go for you? What about in a Buddhist or a Hindu-led country? What about in the secularizing countries of Western Europe and even in this country as things continue to secularize fast in certain areas? How is living Jesus' life going to actually work? How is Jesus' way going to fare in our school system? How's it going to fare in the corporate ladder climbing workaday world? How's it going to fare in the HOA or the PTA or some sort of professional organization that you're in? If you live out Jesus' way in any of those settings, how's it going to go? There's no way to give one answer that would touch all of those, except to say this. If we truly live the way we're supposed to, wherever we are, we're going to start actually changing the world as we interact with it. And that's what's really encouraging about this. I'm a little afraid that for some of us what we do is we think, okay, well, how do I live the Christian life without it going poorly? All I'm trying to do is figure out a way to do it so that it doesn't go bad, right? And so if I can pull that off, then that's what Jesus wants for me, is to live a life that doesn't ruin my life trying to do it His way. It's not at all what He wants for us, is it? What He wants for us is to live the good life, to embody the nature of being one of His own, and let that start to not just survive the world, but to change the world. And that's what the whole idea of salt and light is all about. That's what these two illustrations, these two metaphors are all about. It's to help us realize that if our identity actually belongs to Him, the world will be changing everywhere we touch it. Things will actually start to happen around us. That'll be, number one, because we are actively trying to make changes. But number two, it's going to happen just because we are passively present and we belong to Jesus. And just by being in the world as people of Jesus, things are going to change around us because that's who we are. That's who He has made us to be. And so let's just talk about both of these metaphors for a few minutes tonight and make a few applications toward the end of how we can actually embody it better so that this will begin to happen. The first one, you are the salt of the earth. You put a true disciple of Jesus into a world that is rotting from immorality and idolatry, and you watch long enough, and there will be some slow but steady changes happening in the lives around that person. You know this, and many people have talked about this over the years, that when salt is used for curing meats, there's a really fascinating chemical process that's going on in all of that. And don't get worried. I'm not smart enough to talk about chemistry, and I'm also not interested enough to talk about chemistry for very long here. But that one kind of is interesting. That chemically, when you're making like a country ham or a pancetta or some sort of salt-cured bacon or whatever it is, the chemical reaction actually is happening between the fibers of the muscles and the salt itself. And what's happening there is it's killing off the bacteria that make meat go bad. It's stopping the decay, and it's keeping the whole thing from turning putrid and stinking and rotting. And along the way, the benefit obviously is it's making the flavor that much better. Makes it delicious, right? And along the way, what's happening is that the meat is not just absorbing the salt and the crystals themselves actually move in there. There's a chemical connection. There's a reaction that's binding the two chemical items together and changing the very nature of both substances so that they become more actually one thing. They become something more complex and better than the sum of the parts. And that's what Jesus is calling us to become. But I like that way of doing it because what he does is remind us that Christians don't change the world by being loud and forceful. We don't change the world by changing the structures that from the top down force it to be what it is. We change the world the same way that salt does, in silence and slowness and just by coming in contact with it. It's a slow and steady and dependable process because that's the way that God made it to work. And so what we're called to do is to be the people who permeate the world. Again, not that we force change upon it, but we permeate it and we save it from rottenness and decay. Now, how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by the purity of our hearts and the meekness and the peacemaking and all that kind of stuff that's talked about in the Beatitudes. Will that change the world fast around us? Nope, it won't. But it will change the world around us. And by the way, this is what Peter talked about in 1 Peter chapter 3, in verses 1 and 2 of that chapter. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, it's that little passage that comes up sometimes when we're talking about marriage. And it's where Peter says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct." It is interesting to me because I grew up with one particular family member in our family tree that thought it was her job to convert her husband to Christianity by badgering. That was what God had called her to do, was just badger him until he finally became a Christian. And Peter says specifically the way that a wife can convert her husband to believe in Jesus is without a word, by her respectful conduct. That's the salt of the earth doing its work. And just trusting that God's way is going to be played out, that it's going to work. Now, let's just also notice here before we move away from this concept that as wonderful as that is and as trustworthy as a simple thing like that really ought to be to us, that Jesus does make a warning here not to waste a good opportunity. He talks about salt losing its saltiness and no longer being able to do the work that it's supposed to. And there's two ways of understanding the warning that he makes right here. Excuse me. And both of them, I think, have a point to warn us as Christians about how our influence gets used or doesn't get used or gets wasted. The first way of understanding this classically has been to say, and you can see this in commentaries everywhere, has been to go back to the historical time and the historical viewpoint of where this was said first. Where did they get salt in Palestine in the first century? Well, a lot of it could have been harvested from the sand, from the beaches and the area surrounding the Dead Sea. And what was interesting about that is when they would harvest salt from around the Dead Sea, it would come in these big chunks. That's essentially chunks of minerals and all sorts of other just dirt and mud and everything that had collected as the water was coming into the Dead Sea. It was all just settling and the sediment came with it and all of that. And so a lot of people have said, what Jesus is teaching them there is not to become that kind of salt, because it was so full of impurities and it was so full of sediment that what would happen is you would use it to cure meat and all the salt would leach out and you'd be just left with these big blocks, these big chunks of dirt and useless other things. And that, of course, was nothing more than road gravel, so you would throw it out and you would walk on it. And of course, if that's the case, then the lesson that Jesus is teaching us is don't have a life that's so crowded with impurities and that is so overcome with all these other things that by the time you've exhibited your influence, there's nothing left, because everything else is just crowded, with all of this other stuff in life. And there's something to be said for that. There's a point to be made right there. But what's even more fascinating to me, and I owe our brother David Key for helping me understand this. David told me one time, I mentioned that very thing right there. And I mentioned as I was teaching the Sermon on the Mount that a commentator pointed out you can't make pure salt unsalty. It's just its chemical nature. You can't change salt to no longer be salt. It will always be what it is. And David came up to me and he said, well, I don't know anything about chemistry, but I do know about making country ham. And he told me the story that from when he grew up on a farm here in Kentucky, that they would butcher a hog in the winter and they would put it in the smokehouse and they would cover it with a layer of salt and leave it sitting until springtime. And he said it wasn't contaminated, it wasn't dirty, it wasn't mixed with anything, it was refined rock salt, pure. That was all that was in there. But you would go in the springtime, you would pick up the meat off the shelf and you would dust away the pebbles that were left over. And he said they hadn't changed at all the way they looked from the time you put it in there in the winter, but you could touch it to your tongue, and it was just a crystal. It had no taste of salt to it whatsoever, because it had been leached into the meat. And it was one of those moments where I went, I know there's a scientist that told me I couldn't change salt to no longer be salt, but I trust hillbilly wisdom on this one. And I think Brother Key was onto something there. That when the meat absorbs the salt, there's nothing left there but crystals. And it really is still just road gravel. It's just quit doing the thing that it was designed to do. And I'm afraid that sometimes we let our Christian life become the same thing. We allow ourselves to do some good work in Christ's kingdom and to preserve some lives, and then we figure, well, I did it, it's done, there's nothing left to give, that's it. And Jesus says if you don't maintain that impact, you don't maintain that kind of influence, if you get complacent and you become worn out or burned out, or you just quit because of some sort of laziness, that's just us kind of saying, look, I've used up all the influence I've got. That's all I'm planning to give. And God's just going to throw us out with the road gravel because we've lost the saltiness, the influence, the power that works through that God uses to work through us to do good in the world. And so I think it's important that we take both Jesus's metaphor to push us forward in hope, but also his warning in that metaphor not to give up and not to let our lives become so crowded that we lose the ability to do what we're supposed to do. And then, of course, the second metaphor that Jesus uses right here is to call us the light of the world. And to think about the impact of this one, I would just ask you to consider this question. When's the last time that you went any significant period of time in your life without light? Did y'all lose power here during the big winter storm about a month and a half ago? I hate to rub it in, but honestly, nothing happened in Colorado. So, we were just kind of sitting happy watching the news about how miserable it was here on the East Coast. I remember, though, catching the news a couple of years ago. I was listening to a news podcast, and then later in the morning, I was listening to some of my preaching colleagues from the Houston area about 2 years ago, when that hurricane hit, when it made landfall, and it wiped out their power for the entire Houston grid. For some places it was out for 5 hours, some places it was out for 3 days. And I remember just sitting as I was listening to some of the news commentary, and particularly listening to my preaching brothers, that everybody acted like this was a new thing, that we were without lights, and it was just this brand new reality that no one had ever experienced or thought possible before. And I remember also being struck that they were doing interviews with the customers of the Houston power grid, and the people were talking about how the city of Houston had really messed up by letting this happen. It was almost like they had done something immoral by allowing a natural disaster to make landfall and knock out their power and take the lights out of their homes. And it was just weird to me to think about how accustomed we've gotten to living life with light, that even when the man-made lights that we're so used to are gone for a few days, we treat that as something that is someone's fault, right? That's a very weird place to be in, to think so intensely, to be so intensely connected to light, to think that you deserve it. And for something to take it away is an immoral thing. We are so dependent on light that we almost never experience life without it. Almost never experience life without it. But I'm bringing that up so that we can look at the spiritual calculation of the world that says, most of the people around you spiritually rarely experience light. Most of the people around us, most of the people that fill up any given large city in this country or any other, live the opposite experience, that they rarely actually see light, at least in a spiritual kind of way. If they don't know Christ, and if they live among others who don't have his light in them, then they probably only get rare glimpses of the Lord's light in their lives. And that's why Jesus calls us not only to shine light, but to be light that goes out to them. Have you ever seen any of the nature documentaries that show the animals that live deep in sea caves that have never seen a single speck of natural light? And then we show up with our flashlights and turn it on them, and we just go, "Ugh, what is that?" It's because life doesn't do well in a place where there's no light. It doesn't go well. It turns out to be kind of ugly. But what we're called to do is to bring the light into environments and to change those environments so that life can thrive there. And so that's what this is all about. It's that when you live your life as you should, things will start to change in the world around you. But in the same way that he did it with the salt of the earth idea, he makes us a warning here about not wasting an opportunity, and we dare not miss it. He makes a warning here that light which is hidden is not helpful to anybody. And I gotta say, to me, it's a little absurd to think about light being hidden. Because even if you take Jesus' metaphor literally here, and he talks about putting a lamp under a basket, what's going to happen? The light's going to pierce through the gaps in the basket. There's really nothing that you can do to completely block out light, except to fully extinguish it. And so what we're told here is to just let the light of Christ emanate from ourselves. What's the only way that that won't happen? It's if you put the light out in yourself. Don't do that. Don't extinguish it. Don't try to hide it under anything. Just let it shine. And allow Jesus to be the one within us that will guide others out of their lost and dark world and into the light of his radiant presence. I heard last night our brother Mark Largen in his prayer here mention something about how it seems like in this country there may be some revival happening. Some people have said we are in a time of revival. And he said, I don't know if that's true, but we pray that it is. I want to say this in a way that I hope doesn't sound like I'm criticizing Mark in any kind of way. But let me just remind all of us, and I'm not criticizing Mark, okay, because Mark prayed for God to bring revival, not for us to do it. So let me say that and then say this. We're not called to bring about revival in the world. I don't know if that's a paradigm shift for everybody like it is for me, but we're not called to bring about a revival in the world. What we're called to do is to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world and let God do the reviving. And he will. He will do that as long as we are heeding Jesus' warnings and we're not giving up on our ability to make an impact. We're not hiding the light. We're not letting the salt lose its flavor. Our job, brothers and sisters, is just to be the presence of Jesus in this world and let God give the increase. Salt halts the degradation and decay in the world around us. Light brings verdant, abundant life. And Jesus says, you are both of those things. So have the influence that you should. And so that's the encouragement for all of us. It is to choose a life that is counterintuitive, that mourns and is poor in spirit and is willing to be persecuted and rejoice in it, and just let that blessed life have a massive impact in the world around us. Now, the challenge when you use PowerPoint in a sermon is, as soon as you get back to the title slide or the black slide, everybody thinks you're done. Not quite. If you'll allow me, what I'd like to do then is just take like 3 minutes here and make some applications for different age brackets and different life situations for how we can actually do this better. You know, I said a little while ago, Jesus is not laying out an action plan in this section. What he's laying out is an identity. You are the light of the world, the salt of the earth. But if you want to figure out how can I be that in a more impactful kind of way, let me just give some pieces of advice quickly for about 4 different groups of us that will hopefully help to make that happen a little more effectively and a little more powerfully in our lives. To those of you that are still in school at any level, let me just remind you of a couple of things. Number 1, how you handle your assignments. Whether you turn them in honestly, which means not plagiarized, and whether you turn them in a timely kind of way, that's going to show some influence. You'll be the salt and the light if you do that well. How you show respect to those who have authority over you, whether it's teachers, principals, deans, or whatever it may be, that's going to have some impact. You will be the salt and the light of the earth, the salt of the earth and the light of the world by doing that. How you dress and how you don't dress in school settings. The words that you use and the words that you don't use. The jokes you laugh at and the ones that you don't. The way that you talk about other people. All of that is a great opportunity for you to be a person with some serious influence and impact. The text threads and the social threads that you occasionally remove yourself from, that's going to have some serious impact in the lives around you. Whether or not you choose to laugh at somebody that other people are laughing at, You can be the salt of the earth and the light of the world by not participating in a lot of settings like that. And then things like how you handle your anger, how you handle lust, and how you handle anxiety. You're going to have a lot of impact by doing that in a powerful kind of way. If your daily life is in touch with a school system somewhere, you're going to have a really wonderful set of opportunities to give the gift of the identity of one of Jesus' people in those settings. Now, to those of us that are in the workaday world, that go to work every day, that are part of some sort of corporate team or doing some sort of blue collar job that we share with a team, anywhere that you have interaction with others, let me just give a couple pieces of advice for that. Number one, when you speak, give credibility to Jesus. And particularly, when you do your work well and someone notices, speak about that in a way that gives credibility to Jesus. It can be something as simple as saying, well, I do a good job because my Lord would want me to do a good job. Now, I know that workplaces have rules about that sort of thing, but I bet there's all sorts of ways, if we're creative enough, that we can find some way to speak credibility in our Savior's name. Pray for your coworkers if you have an opportunity to do that. Some of the best examples that I've ever seen of a boss was one who had the willingness to just say, hey, listen, not as your boss, but as your friend, can I pray for you right now? I know you're not a person of faith, but I am. Can I pray about that for you? And it makes a huge impact. And then help others succeed. On the job, help other people succeed. And let me put a real fine point on that. Sometimes we understand, like we totally get it, that if I help that person succeed, it's going to slow me down in this job place, in this market. Good. Do it. Do it. Be there for someone else and make them wonder, what in the world are you thinking? You're helping me. You're slowing yourself down. What's going on? Because the more they wonder, what in the world are you thinking, the closer you are to have an opportunity to tell them what in the world you're thinking, which is that Jesus loves others and puts them first, and you want to do it like he does. All right, now to those of you who are retired. To those of you who are retired, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And can I just ask you, with all the sincerity that I have, and without an ounce of disrespect, can I plead with you, please do not retreat when you retire. Do not withdraw from relationships when you retire from working. That's a wonderful season to visit orphans and widows, even if you are a widow. Retirement is a wonderful season to visit orphans and widows. Retirement is a wonderful season to be present even for those who will not have the ability to return your goodness, to reciprocate it in some sort of way. But you can be there and give them a gift. Just keep showing up. Just keep showing up and be there for other people, and it will make an impact in the world. Don't retreat when you retire. Your field of influence has changed, but your potential for influence has not. Please, please continue to live out the ideals of the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And then my last group here. To those who labor in preaching and teaching. Sometimes we have to go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Sometimes we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world by specifically staying among the saints and being an influence in the lives of the saints who need us, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But don't always do that. Because the same Lord who sent out the apostles to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the same Lord that came for those people himself, also said that a shepherd who has lost one of his 100 sheep will leave the 99 on the mountain and go seek and find the one that is lost. Don't forget and don't neglect to connect with those who are outside of Jesus Christ. People ask me all the time, and I don't know why they do this, because I don't think there's anything about me that gives credibility to this question uniquely being asked to Dan Lankford. But people ask me all the time, what do you do for outreach? What's your strategy for teaching people the gospel? How do you get people and bring them in to become saved? And my answer is not a strategy at all. My answer is just an effort. It's an ideal. The ideal is be present, be honest, and ask them to read the Gospel of John. That's it. Now, I'm not saying that's a great technique. I'm not looking for a technique. What I'm looking for is relationships. I want to be present, and when people ask me about Jesus, I want to be honest about Jesus, and then I want them to know him. That's what this is really all about. And so I'm just encouraging my brothers and sisters who labor in preaching and teaching, who want to help others come to know Christ, do the same. Be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Be present, be honest, and hand them the gospel. And let it lead them into knowing him and being saved by him. It is not those who are well, but those who are sick who need a doctor. Let's make sure that we continue to be the people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and who go find those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and we bring them to know the Lord. So, these are Jesus' words. Let me read them one more time so that hopefully they sink deep into our hearts. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, you let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works, and they give glory to your Father who is in heaven. That's my prayer for you. And I hope that we can understand that we have to do that intentionally, but if we're who we should be, we'll be able to just let God do that through us all the time. And he will bring those who want to know him to himself. If there's somebody among us tonight that has a spiritual need that you want to make known in a public kind of way, why don't you come and talk to me or to one of the shepherds of this good church about that while we stand and sing together.